Yeah, my name is Aaron Ajiman. I'm originally from Ghana, been in Canada for quite a bit, and my background was into environment and public policy, and also a little bit natural resources and forest recreation.
Okay.
Worked in industry a little bit, and decided to come take this program. Last semester, I was at WorkSafe BC for my practicum. So it was a really good experience working with a regulatory body and seeing how they do inspections and how they exercise the big stick and also encourage people to do the right things was quite phenomenal to experience.
Okay, excellent.
My name is Hang Yu, and I come from China. I got my bachelor degree in environmental science in Sun Yat-sen University, and I did my co-op program this summer in Lehigh Hansen, collecting some samples and analyzing them, generating reports for them to be in compliance with the regulation here and also in Manitoba province. Yeah.
My name is Ehsan. I have a master's in health and safety and have worked for 8 years in the same field, not here in Iran.
Okay. Excellent. And so we have this gentleman in the corner. So he was reviewing my teaching of this class because I am one of the newer faculty members, although now aging, I guess, into my second trimester. I don't know if of faculty. So I'm a partner faculty. I'm one of these odd beasts. So I don't reside at UBC. My main affiliation is with the Ministry of Agriculture, so I'm the leader for veterinary science and diagnostics, and in that capacity, I report to the Chief Veterinary Health Officer. So I run all the diagnostics for the province. I also am the BC Regional Director for this organization called the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, and that's our national wildlife disease surveillance network. And that is where the project or the case study we're gonna talk about today comes from. And then I'm an assistant professor in the School of Population and Public Health. So systems thinking, why did I want to talk to you guys about this? Mike was originally like, talk about rats. Because in the school I'm famous for my research on rats and rat-associated diseases. But while I would love to have a few hours to talk about rats, really, for me, one of the biggest aha moments or great moments of progress for the project as a whole, which is growing to this day, has been a journey into systems thinking and using systems thinking to actually look at rats as an environmental health issue within the city of Vancouver. So that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. And I called it a journey. Did anyone know about this model, the hero's journey? My main course I teach here is actually in communication and risk communication. And we teach a lot about narrative and how narrative helps people to understand their personal journey and the world around them. And this is like the classic parable of the hero, that he's called to adventure. He has this, basically trials and tribulations, and then has some sort of a revelation and transformation that returns him to the original state, but with a different level of understanding. And I call this is like the hero's journey into systems thinking, because this is sort of an ongoing process by which even I continue to go along this cycle. And also to let you know, I'm not going to teach you everything about systems thinking in this class. I'm going to get you started on your own personal journey. I hope not to leave you in the abyss. Although, as you can see, that's the point where there's transformation. So if that's how you feel, I would argue that that's actually a good thing. But at least to get you past this threshold into this unknown world of systems thinking and make it somewhat more knowable for you. So I also think science has gone through a hero's journey with regard to systems thinking. So in the beginning, there was God or a deity, some sort of omniscient, omnipotent being that explained life on Earth, that everyone said this was the reason things are. And then we were called to adventure, and that adventure was science and the invention of reductionist thinking, that no, actually, we can explain things we thought were supernatural or unexplained using this sort of reductionist theory. But now we understand that, you know, first there was only the whole, then there were only the parts, and now we understand that the whole is a product of the sum of the parts, and in many cases more than the sum of the parts. And that's really where systems thinking comes in, and I like, this was kind of an accident of the arrangement, but I like how it's kind of making that hero's journey connection that, and Barry Richmond was the inventor of systems thinking. He was actually a computer scientist, and a lot of this comes from the field of computer science. And I love this quote, because systems thinkers see both the forest and the trees, but with one eye on each. And that's really a great analogy. So what I wanted to do is to just take a few moments and get you to reflect on that sort of unknowable paper that I sent you. That's probably the best paper there is on the state of systems thinking in public health. But I wanted to get an idea from you guys on sort of what did you get from that paper? What were some of the take-home points? What did you learn about systems thinking? And I sort of guided your thinking in two categories, that either sort of what systems thinking is, or what is the theory of systems thinking, and then how is it actually practiced in public health? And where does it work and where does it not work? So, any comments? What did you think?
One thing it said was that although it aims to look at the components of the system, but as you said, you can see with one eye the forest and the other with the trees. Its main focus is on the whole direction that the system is going through.
Okay.
Right? Yeah, so I mean, adding together all those components will reach that objective of the system.
Okay, so then it's some sort of whole, and that whole has components. Absolutely, what else? Anyone else? Can be anything.
Yeah, it's like all the components will have to be in sync together to make the whole effective in a way.
Absolutely. Something about relationships
Yeah.
are important. Anything else? What about the how it's implemented in public health? What was your take home?
Yeah, in this article, the conclusion, the author suggests that it seems like the software modeling technology are likely to be the most useful.
Okay, say that again.
The software modeling technology seems like to be the most useful in public health areas.
I keep inching this over to move it. Okay, so there was that idea of hard versus soft systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like sort of which was best. There was
The soft systems seems like the best.
Okay, yeah. Is a weird paper, right? Because they start out and they like make a hard sell for the hard. They're like, oh yeah, you know, that's science. There are numbers, you know, to hold on to. And then they sort of almost veer off into the weeds. And what's sort of the reasoning that they give that hard systems modeling might not be super helpful?
Because it relies on quantitative data, which may not be always the answer to the problems that we're facing.
Yeah.
And we need to resort to qualitative approaches to
Yeah.
resolve these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. So something like there's sort of it's almost, it was like it's by trying to quantitate it, you're using like reverting back to a reductionist approach a little bit, but they're hard to make, and even harder to validate, right? So then they go into this idea that maybe we should be doing soft systems is what's realistic for public health. And what was, any take on that? What did they feel like soft systems was?
I
it's almost like the soft system is more fluid, whilst the hard system is more data oriented, so it's easy to actually interpret your information.
Yes, yes, and I love what you said, because I felt like they were going through their own hero's journey in wrestling with this, because they sort of mentioned how they're like, oh, everyone's doing it, but nobody's doing it, and soft systems, maybe that's the way to go, but it doesn't stand the usual scientific tests. And I think it's something along the lines of it's not an approach. It is not like a logistic regression model. It's more, a set of methodologies or a way to look at the problem. So it's fluid. I love that. I'm gonna write that down because I like that. And he actually, they write at one point that it's like they love and hate this, because they're like, well, we should have innovation, but then what about validation? And how do you balance innovation and validation? So the paper was a little bit hard to wade through, but I think it really embodied this sort of tug of war of like, what is systems science in public health? So you got through a lot of actually the stuff that I took from the paper that focuses on the whole rather than the parts. It's the components and the relationship between them. You can pick out, make some mention of behavior as being an important component, that it's good for unified versus multi-component solutions, and it aligns with current frameworks for decision making. And this is another big one, is action oriented. It's really not for the purpose of observation so much as looking for places for intervention. And then this idea that, which I think is important here, is I'm not going to say like, throw away everything that Hugh and Karen have ever taught you and do systems thinking. It really maps onto existing practices. It's a new tool to add to your toolkit. It's a broad class of analytic approaches, and it's difficult to operationalize, and that's because I think there's this sort of tug of people wanting to really pin it down to one thing. What I think I took away is it's a lens through which to see the problem, a way to change the language, methods, and methodologies for conceptualizing and acting within complexity. So that's really how I use systems thinking in my own practice, is a different way to look at the problem. And that's what we're going to try and implement today. Use it as a lens through which to see your projects with a new perspective. So what is systems thinking? I think the Buddha said it best. That all things appear and disappear because of the concurrence of causes and conditions. Nothing ever exists entirely alone, and everything is in relation to everything else. So I love that. It's very philosophical. Probably a lot of you are scratching your heads. What on earth does that mean with regard to systems thinking? So let's get something we can chew on a bit more. This was, again, out of computer science, but towards getting an actual working definition for systems thinking, which is used across all disciplines, like public health, business, politics. So systems thinking is a set of synergistic analytic skills used to improve the capability of identifying, understanding systems, predicting their behavior, and devising modifications. So I think the important part here is it's a set of skills. And the point is to understand the system, to be able to predict it, and to use it to generate interventions. So now we're going to talk about coronavirus later. But actually, as I was thinking about coronavirus, I was like, man, there's a different virus that shows the value of the systems thinking approach. So before we go into systems thinking, I want to sell you on it. That this can be used to save the world. Maybe not every time, but this time it made a huge difference. And the cool thing about this was a graduate student who solved this global health pandemic using a systems approach, or potential global health pandemic, halted it in its tracks. So I want to take you back to 1998. There was this outbreak of neurologic disease in Malaysia. Really scary disease. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from someone describing it in a moment. Originally thought to be Japanese encephalitis, based on 4 serum samples. So these were sent to the WHO. So serum samples just tells you you've been exposed to a virus. Japanese encephalitis is endemic in Malaysia. probably the most common cause of neurologic disease. But it didn't look like it to people on the ground. But they sent it to the WHO, and the WHO said, this is Japanese encephalitis. There you go. And so they started mosquito fogging and vaccination. Meanwhile, this epidemic was raging and starting to spread to other parts of Malaysia and then jumping over into Singapore. And later, it emerged in Bangladesh. And this is the man who solved it. So, and I just want to read to you a little bit because I love this account of him. So this is Dr. Chua, and he was a graduate student in Malaysia at the time. And he says, this is from a news article at that time. The disease struck lightning fast. Young men would be healthy one day, and the next day their brains would swell up. They couldn't walk or talk. They'd become comatose, and some of them paralyzed, says Dr. C.T. Tan, who is a neurologist at the University of Malaysia. Some even had what looked like locked-in syndrome. They were conscious, but they couldn't move or speak. There was nothing Tan could do, no treatment, no cure, and a 50% mortality rate. So half of the patients died. It was terrifying. Nearly 1 in 3 families in this region of Malaysia lost someone to the virus. And the window of opportunity to contain the disease was closing because it had recently skipped over to Singapore, where 4 million people lived. So that the Malaysian government told people not to worry, that it was Japanese encephalitis. They were going to control it by fogging for mosquitoes. But this is when Dr. Chua thought something was wrong, and there was one big clue. So he's on the ground, he's looking. He said Muslims were not getting sick. Only the ethnic locals were getting sick. And if the disease was coming through mosquitoes, you would not have Muslims, Hindus, and Christians. You would have Muslims, Hindus, and Christians getting sick. But only Chinese Malaysians were catching the disease, and specifically only Chinese farmers who were raising pigs. And as we know, Muslims do not handle pigs. So this was the point that was his aha moment. And he eventually managed to break down what was the actual cause and the transmission pathway and inform the government, and they were able to stop the outbreak. And this is what he found out, which was really cool. So I'm going to present it to you the wrong way that he thought about it, because of course he thought about it from the people and then worked backwards. But he figured this out and published this in a paper not long after the outbreak. So what's the actual cause of this outbreak? Economic development. Malaysia had a boom decade in the 90s. And what that resulted in was massive deforestation, anthropogenic deforestation. So they're clearing the land, they're using it for other purposes. At the same time, people have more money. When they have more money, they eat more meat. So suddenly they had to increase domestic production, and pork is a major product consumed there. So they intensified pork production. But they didn't have enough resources to feed the pigs. So what they did is actually quite genius. They combined fruit and pig production. So the pigs could run underneath the orchards and eat all of the dead fruit, clean up the dead fruit, don't have to pay to feed your pigs as much. Suddenly you've got this really great, efficient system. But all these things were happening in concert. So this is the reservoir of Nipah virus, which seems to be the reservoir of all the big scaries, which is this Asian fruit bat. So because of the deforestation, the bats left their native habitat and came to the orchard. They're fruit bats, okay? And then they're defecating on the pigs, and pigs are uniquely sensitive to this virus. And pigs are biologically very similar to humans. People who are sci-fi fans will know they're sort of our closest relative biologically. And so these pigs were getting infected, amplifying the virus and spreading it to the pig farmers. And interestingly, part of the reason that it spread is the government started to have quarantines back when they thought it was Japanese encephalitis, and farmers couldn't get their pigs to market locally. And so they actually started shipping infected pigs to other regions, and that was what precipitated the spread in Malaysia. Interestingly enough, it emerged in Bangladesh, and Chua figured this out as well, that he's like, oh, the people getting infected in Bangladesh were not pig farmers. So how does that work? Well, the same principal causes of deforestation because of economic development were leading the bats to go to the date palm groves. And bats were defecating around these areas where people were harvesting date palm sap. So a great systems solution or a systems understanding. And what they've actually done, so then they did introduce a system solution where they kept their intensity, but they've actually changed the way they raise pork and currently still have those changes in Malaysia where they do no longer have pork and orchard growing at the same time, and they also have a system of decreased animal density so that if there are outbreaks that they don't spread to the degree it did before. Okay, so the moral of the story, as much as he is a staggering bar to live up to being a grad student, is we can do it. We can do it too. And so what I want to do now is break this down for you, is to say, okay, we've sort of read this puzzling paper, but we think we get that it might be important, it might be valuable. One of the big take-homes from the paper was it's very difficult to operationalize. So I'm going to try and operationalize this with you. And he was asking me where I came up with this, but I actually came up with this when I was trying to explain to one of my grad students who was working on the RAT project about how to use systems thinking. With the caveat that I am not a good chess player, but I have come from a family of chess players, so those chess enthusiasts may not like my analogy, but we're going to go with it. So, what is a system? There's one thing for you guys to take home. This is a system. It has 3 components. It has structure, but equally important to the structure are the relationships between the elements. And then the structure and the relationships usually combine to produce some sort of behavior within the system. Although the behavior can actually feed back and change the structure and the relationships, hence the 3-way arrow. How does this relate to chess? Well, I say structure is like the game board, okay? The relationships are like the rules, and the function is like the players. So the game board is what you can see. This is usually the easiest part of the system, so laying out the different components. The relationships, you can't see them, they're not obvious, but you have to understand them in order to play the game. You have to know how they work, and the rules are basically how the pieces relate to each other and to the board, right? So the rules are all about relationships. And then the players are what is needed to actually impart the behavior, to get the system moving in a dynamic way. And as anyone that knows, great chess players and great chess masters, there can be different behaviors all the time. And that'll depend on the other player, on their evolution. So this idea that there's something dynamic. So what I want to do while we work through these components is to actually show you how I use systems thinking using a case study of rats in the city of Vancouver. So I've been studying rats for a long time now. Started as a graduate student and was not able to solve the problem as a graduate student, so it's bled over into my professional career. But as I worked more and more in this area, started to realize we just do not have a good set of tools to deal with rat-related environmental health issues in the city. And so I've been working with the City of Vancouver for about 10 years since the start of the project. So this is with the streets department. And so rats are perceived as posing an environmental health threat within the city. I think that's probably not a hard sell. It's pretty much wherever they are, they're considered to pose a threat. So the City of Vancouver actually approached me and said, here's some money, find a solution to the rat problem. And I'm not kidding, that's really the level of, we've got a problem, solve the rat problem. So that's what I had to start out with. So without a systems thinking approach, okay, rats are a problem, what you gonna do? Just tell me, your total gut reaction. You got a rat infestation, what are you gonna do?
You're gonna look at where they're coming from. What are they?
You're already being a systems thinker. No. Right? You got a rat, you run to Canadian Tire and you grab, what?
Rat traps.
Yes! You kill the rats, right?
Yeah.
You got a rat problem, you kill the rats. New York City spends $10 million a year killing rats. Just killing rats. $10 million. So that is the #1 most common solution to rats. And that was was the question. Is that this is what Vancouver should do? Should we have a rat trapping department and should we be out trapping rats? So I said, okay, let's take a step back. Let's actually think about the city as a system. So here is our first part. These are the elements. The game board. So you need to think about what are the components of the system, what does each component consist of, and who are the individuals and organizations in each component. So I want you guys to work through this with me. So what are the components of my system?
Rat.
Yes, thank you, exactly. We're gonna call them rats. There you go. Who else is in the system?
People in Vancouver.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's call them citizens. So people who are like forced to live with rats, basically. Who else is in here? I just mentioned them to you. Who controls the city? Basically. Yeah, let's,
Government, city officials.
yeah, good, good. So let's call them government. Okay, and the components don't always have to be biotic. What else is a component of this system?
Money.
We're the Department of Occupational and,
Environmental hygiene.
so we need some sort of an environment, right, for this
Yeah.
all to take place in. Okay, okay, so now let's just break down the different parts of this component. So, citizens, what are different ways that they could interact with rats?
Well, they can be sources of food for the rats, and depending on how they interact with the environment, right? When they throw food around or they leave their garbage outside, it provides a source of resource for the rats.
Yes, we're getting into relationships now. I'm just trying to classify, I'm trying to break out citizens a bit more. So what are different ways that people just might come into contact with rats?
Just,
So maybe like super simple. I was joking with George before. I'm like, I work for the government. I'm a very simple thinker. So let's just call them residents. Okay, like in your home.
yeah.
Yeah, in your home, on the street, where you live. People are residents. And then maybe the big one for environmental health is often I'll call businesses. So like restaurants. You don't want to be, that chowdery, whatever you guys hear about that.
Yeah.
Right? So business, okay, good. We've got, what are the components of our environment? Just in really broad terms. I'm gonna start you out, I'll call it natural environment. So that's like season and weather, precipitation, and then what else is
The
in this?
built environment.
Yeah, good. Built environment, okay. Rats, I will tell you, I'm just gonna go like this, because rats have their own complex societies, just like people do. And so residents as well, one axis that I'll tell you that's important here is socioeconomic status. Okay, because that's gonna affect our system as well, who's in contact with rats. And then for government, we mentioned the city. I mean that as like big G government, like official type people. Who are some other official type people in Vancouver who do health stuff? Who's in charge of like your vaccination programs and?
Is it called the public health department?
Yeah, so coastal health would be the big one in Vancouver. So let's just say, we'll just call them health. And they've got, and then within these, you can even break these out further. So the city has, we'll call them public servants. And they have elected officials, right? So these people are hired, these people are elected. And then you sort of have the same in health, right? You have like your foot soldiers, right? Environmental health officers, they get work done, but they don't get to make decisions. And then you've got leadership. Okay, so that gives you, so you're getting like a better view of the game board maybe? Not how they're interconnected, just just what are the pieces on this board, okay? Okay, now we set up our game board. Let's talk about the rules. So what are the relationship between these systems elements? And what are the nature of these relationships? So let's go down the row and tell me where you want me to put a relationship. Maybe we'll start in reverse because you already suggested one,
Food.
right? Yeah? People give rats food.
Food, yeah.
And rats trouble people. This is the whole, this is the rat problem right here. We'll talk about that in a second. But yes, so rats harass people, people give rats food and harborage. Where else should we put a relationship? Anywhere, I'll give you a hint. There are going to be a lot, so pretty much there's nothing you can say that will not be a relationship. What do you think? Even if you don't know how they're connected. I'll give you another hint. Here's a big one.
Shelter, maybe.
Yep, so rats, I should do this in a different color. Yep, rats rely on the environment, and probably actually more the built environment than anything else, than the natural environment. They make what we build as homes for themselves. Okay, do you think that people are affected by the environment they live in? That shouldn't be a hard sell for our department, right? Yeah. Okay, so people influence their environment and they're affected by their environment. And then what about, let's connect these guys over here.
Governments want the rats dead.
Yeah, absolutely. You would think that maybe?
Yeah.
We'll talk about that in a moment when we talk about dynamic system properties, the unpredictable. Since we've said rats pose a health issue, you'd think this would be a connection, but in Vancouver it's not. What else?
City influences the citizens in terms of what to do and what not to do. Where
Absolutely.
people can live.
Yeah. And how do the citizens influence? Almost all relationships are two-sided in some way. I sometimes struggle to say, this is the one I think is kind of one-sided. I'm not sure how much the rats actually influence their environment, but most of them are two-sided. So how do citizens influence a city?
Elected official, and they pay taxes too.
Excellent. Yeah, money, votes. We're going to talk about these things in a moment. Okay, so, and really, the elected officials, this is also a relationship, right?
Yeah.
An important relationship. These guys get the public servants to do what they want, and these guys are in charge of making sure that they are electable in the next election. Okay?
Business.
And then, sorry?
There's a business and the rats too.
Yeah. Good. And of course, this, right?
Yeah.
Health is mainly concerned with people. And people's problems are supposed to be health problems, right? And then to some degree, there's this relationship. These guys have to work in synchrony, and the environment is actually a very interesting nexus with regard to the interaction between city and health. And maybe at some point we can get Karen and you to comment on experiences, right? Because this is an area where both parties have jurisdiction. And we'll talk about that in a sec. Okay, so I think we're pretty good. So we've got, what's one thing you've noticed here about the number of relationships compared to the number of core elements?
There are more relationships than elements.
Yes, this is a huge thing. And this is when you make the transition into systems thinking. When you start to value the relationships as much as the elements and recognize that they are more important and more complex than the elements themselves. Okay, so now the dynamics. Let's introduce the players. So this is where systems thinking starts to get complex. And when you get into reading, you can really get off into the weeds with regard to dynamics. There's lots of things like stocks and flows and all sorts of jargon. But basically, this is a way to think of when you get all these relationships and all these components together, how do they actually act? And why do they act the way they do? So one thing that I have used as a unifying theory is basically factors affecting decision making. Why do people make the decisions that they do in a system? And I work primarily in like human dominated systems. So we'll talk a little bit about like the impact of rats, but a lot of it is based on human decision making. And the things that influence human decision making are currency and finite resources. So one of the things just to take a small digression, when I teach my communications class and I get students to take a paper, and I'm like, what's a communicable message from this paper? And who would you tell and what would you ask them to do? And they're like, oh yes, we're gonna go to the city of Vancouver and we're gonna change bus routes and we're gonna add grocery stores and we're gonna do this and this and this. And then I go, yeah, with what? Right? Are you gonna increase property taxes again? Are you gonna ask the city to do that? No way, that is like the worst hot potato ever, right? So that's this idea that we have a finite set of resources, and first of all, when you ask for an intervention, realize that you're asking for a currency of some form or another. You're asking for money, you're asking for political capital, you're asking for social capital. You're always asking for something, and when you ask for something, you're taking away people's resources to give to something else, most of the time. And that's a really key part when you're looking at systems-based interventions, understanding it. And the computer term for that is stocks and flows. How much stock or currency you have and where you're asking it to flow to. But also, you have ideas of values, sort of, that can, regardless of currency, people will make decisions based on values. And then, outside of the decision-making framework, you have interesting dynamic behaviors. So this is sort of like, the best analogy would be, like a Twitter firestorm or something. It was very unpredicted, that emerged from the dynamics of that Twitter system. And we'll talk about that in relation to rats in a sec. But also unpredictability. So the idea is, this is sort of a progression on dynamic behavior, where the system can suddenly take a life of its own that you would never predict just by looking at the component parts. So part of being a good system scientist is actually, I would argue, like the antithesis of hard modeling, because the whole idea is that the system is inherently unpredictable. Therefore, trying to create a mathematical model that's going to hold true over time is like virtually diametrically opposed to that theory. Okay, so let's just talk about some values here. Values and any other sorts of behaviors. So let's talk about decision making first. Go up here. What do you think matters to the city with regard to decision making? We already talked about some of this.
The city wants to just get rid of the rats to begin with. So
yeah, and why do you think they care?
Because of public health and also nuisance.
Do they care about public health? Whose job is it to care? Whose job is it to care about health?
The health authorities.
Okay, so yeah, they're supposed to care about health, but they've got, interestingly enough, they do not want any part of this rat problem. And they will have gone on record in the media saying rats pose no risk to public health, except when they're in your chowder. That's the only time. But why? This is perfectly understandable behavior in this system. Okay? They're like in the middle of an opioid epidemic, right? They're gonna put like rat trappers on the street? No, right? So this is to me this is a big behavior. No resources. And it's low profile, low priority. So they accept this is the only axis that the health region will get involved in. That is no longer a relationship until we have some, and I'm going to argue why that actually should be a relationship for a totally different reason in a moment. Okay, what about these guys? What if influences their thinking? I put right here. Elected. So why does the city care? Because people call in to 311 lines, especially people from Shaughnessy, say there's rats on my block. And it really makes me angry. And the person who brought me into this was actually Jeff Meggs, who's now gone over to work for John Horgan. And he's just like, I've just got these people calling me from Shaughnessy, and they're, our biggest, donors. We want to keep them happy. You need to do something. You need to solve the rat problem. So this is votes, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge thing. But at the same time, we talked about, money. Where is that going to come from? We already know we're super squeezed. Who else we talked about this and this. So what might be another factor influencing decision making or influencing the behavior of this system?
Well, I was going to say residents. Some, let's say, neighborhoods that are heavily infested, people will choose not to live there. And if people choose to live in more expensive places, that's also money. It's resources.
Yeah, so now you're totally going with me on this odyssey, because there is an emergent behavior here. If this is high and this is low, rats predominantly affect low socioeconomic status neighborhoods, and that's because they thrive on garbage, rundown infrastructure, old buildings, all these things affect rats. Interestingly enough, these are the people that call the city the most. And so we're talking about currency. How do they have the ability to deal with rats on their own?
No.
Right? Because this is a money. So the city, though, interestingly enough, so we say they affect the citizens, but only in certain areas, right? Like not in their own home as well. And yet these people don't have the ability to deal with it themselves. So we're getting some idea of, and now I want to go one last thing about dynamic behavior. So now that I've gone through this whole thing, should we kill the rats? Let's take it back to the original. And I think I'm going to leave you with this for a second, because this is the idea of dynamic behavior, recognizing that each component of a system is a system in and of itself. And part of being a good system scientist is thinking about intervention and then thinking about the possible consequences, the possible behavior consequences. So that was where I ended up, mapping out this, saying, what's going to happen if we do kill the rats? So this is, now you've got yourself set up. Now let's play the systems thinking game. This is how you do it. So we're going to define our problem within the system and situate it. We're going to identify realistic, attainable, and effective opportunities for intervention. We're going to predict or observe the effects of the intervention, and then start our hero's journey again, readjust the system, and redefine it. So we discussed this. Somewhere in here is really where the problem lies. If people were not bothered by rats, then the city wouldn't care about it. No one else would care about it. So it exists somewhere in here. So we kill the rats. So we thought to ourselves, okay, what would happen if we actually did that? So rats are killed mostly because they pose a health threat from infectious disease. Right? People say they're filthy, they're shedding organisms. So when I was asked, okay, what would happen if we killed rats, I thought of a similar system that was in the UK with badgers, where badgers had a disease called tuberculosis. They were spreading to cattle. They killed all the badgers. The tuberculosis in cattle got worse than previously. And that had to do with the animals being their own system. So these rats live in family units, within their environment. And these are highly social, intelligent beings. There's a reason that we can take a picture of a black hole in space, but we are still in the same place with rats. We were in medieval ages. They are incredibly organized, very intelligent, social creatures. So these guys, so let's say, this colony has disease. And even within, you can think of a colony like this. So you've got your top rat here. I still have to learn to draw rats. And then all of your sort of underdogs here. So in a broad sense, we kill rats in this colony here. What do you think is going to happen to the rats? You don't even have to know rats to predict. What would happen if you like went into a coronavirus? What happens if you go into a society and you kill people? What happens?
They will adapt. Those that are remaining will
They will
adapt.
probably migrate to
What's the
somewhere.
first thing that happens? People
Right.
freak
Freak
out,
out.
right? Chaos. Chaos is the first thing that follows like a sudden event. We'll talk about this in communications as well, right? People freak out. The animals freak out too. They suddenly, this guy is gone. No one knows what they're doing. They're under assault. So you're right, absolutely. They're going to migrate out. And the ones within are suddenly going to have to fight each other for social order. So now you've got a mass population migration and social upheaval. And is that a cocktail for disease control, infectious disease control?
Yes.
Is
Because,
it?
Yeah, the rats will now move into take much larger areas instead of being confined in
Yes,
small
so
locations. because-
not control, right?
Yeah.
So suddenly you've taken it, what was in one area and a few rats,
Yeah.
and you've spread it around. So we actually said, okay, can we test our system? And we did, and Mike Lee, who's in your cohort, did this for his master's degree, and we found it does. Rats have a tremendously elevated disease burden after an intervention than before. Not only that, okay, now we've talked about that system. This is a currency, okay? Also, so this is a relationship, but it's also dumping currency in here, right?
Mhm.
So food, resources, I'm sorry, I have really bad writing, and the same thing here. So this is still dumping. So what do you think is gonna happen when you go back in 6 months? If you have, every 4 weeks, every rat in the population has a litter of 10 young. What's it gonna look like in 6 months? If you just kill a bunch and then leave?
It's gonna spread out.
They're gonna go back to the exact same number there were before. They have an amazing reproductive capacity, and you haven't changed this relationship. And you haven't put a cork in that currency. So now this is what New York does and spends $10 million a year doing. While they have no garbage cans, they're part of our study actually, our group that's working, because they persist in just killing. It's like, trying to put your finger in the proverbial dike. Okay, so that's not gonna work. It's not really sustainable. It also has unintended consequences, actually, this intervention. So we're gonna dump poison. Poison is the easiest way to control rats across a large geographic area, right? You don't have to maintain them and clear the traps and whatever. So what's gonna be, do you think, the consequences of spreading poison across Vancouver?
It goes into the natural environment. It goes into the soil. Other animals that depend on rats will eat them and die, and goes up the food chain.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a key one. So Port of Vancouver approached us because they had a resident barn owl population that has been decimated because of rat poison in the city. And they asked me through a totally different channel, can you help us to repopulate this barn owl? I was like, not while this is still being pumped into the environment, right? You're not thinking about the system. Okay, so last part before I turn you out to your own devices is, so I think I've maybe convinced you that like a mass rat cull in and of itself, we should take that off the table for Vancouver. Probably not a good use of money at all. But, so if I told you, so let's just backtrack a bit, because this is what health says. So health looks at the city and says, why are you guys doing anything? Because, people aren't dying of rat-associated diseases. So it's not a health problem. We don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. So that's valid, right? You don't hear about, there's no epidemics of bubonic plague. So that's fine. But then I ask you a question. If I could tell you 100% that rats pose no health risk to you, would you still want them living in your apartment?
No.
No. Right? There's something else going on there. There's something in this relationship. This is not just a transaction of diseases here. There is something that has nothing to do with the rats, really, in and of themselves and what they're actively doing. This relationship is problematic. So then we actually went and asked people. We did a qualitative study and we said, why do you care about rats? And the answers are different in high socioeconomic status versus low socioeconomic status groups. I'm just going to talk about the latter for a second. The interesting thing was that, so people from the downtown east side particularly said that rats were, first of all, a mental health consequence. So that's adding a different component to the system, which I think I would like to say, starts to make it a problem, and is significant. It's amazing what people say. I avoid sleeping at certain hours because I know rats come out during those hours, and I have no home and I have no place to go, and I don't want to, so I wake myself up so I don't have to deal with this. I no longer go and engage in the public garden because there are so many rats there that I would rather not be there. So really significant mental health consequences. And when you ask people why, interestingly enough, this is the problem. That rats are a symptom of a disordered environment. That people are stressed out because of the environment they are forced to live in. If any of you spent time in the downtown east side, you can see why it's a stressful environment. Okay? And rats are really, honestly, just a symbol for people, a consequence of that, of living in this environment. And moreover, they're a symptom of political indifference. People say, I've got some great quotes about, if this was a problem in Shaughnessy, it would already be solved. Like that, this is a symbol that we don't carry currency for our elected officials, and so that the problem's not addressed. So one of the things we're talking with the city about is, really the city, and this gets crazy. So you have to do different iterations of systems thinking. This is where I want the city to intervene at like a three-way nexus here, looking at bylaws for environmental health rights. So the right for tenants to live in a rat-free environment. There's consequences for developers if they leave a mess that rats can infest, which was a problem with the demolishing of some buildings in the downtown east side, and that it'll be a problem for landlords who don't address rats in single-room occupancy hotels. So using the system, you start to find solutions that have nothing to do with the rats themselves. Okay. So parting thoughts before I give you all a little bit of time to work through your own systems. If you were going to take away some take-home messages about using systems thinking, it's understand the game you're playing. That's just valuable in and of itself. Who are the players? What are their motivations? How are they connected to each other? Play to win. This is one thing that so working in a government agency, we are always on the intervention side. We're really, really heavy intervention. But we need smart people to tell us what to do. And I feel like there's this, government has all the answers and they will descend and do things. So I would encourage all of you, we need your information and your recommendations. So, really, really action-oriented, and also be in it for the long game. This system took me 10 years to figure out, okay? So this is not something you sit down and you do in one go. And also, my favorite quote of all time was from Barack Obama. Better is good. Can you win a chess game with one move? No, it is impossible. And that is the same with systems thinking. It's all about incremental gains. And I think sometimes students get defeated if they can't get all the way to the win in a single intervention or a single study. But systems thinking is all about incremental gains and testing part of the system. And better is good, and maybe eventually you'll get there. But probably not, because the system will exhibit emergent behavior and change. And then you'll have to adapt. Okay. So, what I want you guys to do is just to take, let's see, because we're done, okay, we're in good time. So I'm going to take about 20 minutes, and I've got for you a handout. Before I do the handout, any questions?
I'm still thinking, how can this problem be solved? In the sense that, let's say this in New York, for instance, with a similar approach, can they still solve the problem? If killing the rat is not a solution, what can you do to mitigate it? I know there's different heads to the puzzle as we've discussed, but is there a one-touch solution?
No. No. I really love that you brought that up because I think that's so important. So what are we talking about? I couldn't tell you all about my system. I could spend 6 hours talking about this system and all the things that we're looking into. So when the city said, what's one thing cities can make and break bylaws so easily. That is their easiest tool. Doesn't take any money, right?
Mhm.
And most people really don't care, except for the people who show up to city council meetings. And so bylaws are a really great tool. So when I was looking at the city, I'm like, this is a good place for you to actually make a difference in people's lives with a tool that has very low currency. So this is a better is good. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it solves some of the problems, right? Okay, so the other thing we're looking at with the city has a lot of authority over this. So this is the part that Mike is working on now in terms of what are ways, for example, that we can look at how development and demolition is done. That's a big source of resource for rats. What is the ways in which we can look at how green space is managed? So there's elements of this we're looking at as well. So one of the things I have actually advocated for is that I think it's foolhardy to try and extirpate rats from the urban landscape. We need to figure out how to live with them. And why I love what you brought up so much, so it's such a systems thinking answer, is that the rats are not the problem. It is the way that we relate to them. And there are ways that we can alter this relationship to minimize harms. And I use a lot of harm reduction strategy with regard to rats, where you can reduce the harms without actually killing the rats. So this is one way. The other thing I've advocated to the city is the city will not get involved in people's residential properties. But they have the ability to for other contexts. So I've said, I think residences should be a priority for helping people with interventions because that's when people are most stressed out by rats. You're going to be more stressed out if you have rats in your home than if you just see them on the street. So what are the tools we have to help residents? Instead of having a team of thousands of rat catchers, we're still going to have to kill some rats, absolutely. That's the reality. I'm not going to tell someone who has an infestation, you should live with the rats. They're going to, tell me where to go with that. So we're still going to have to do some rat control, but can we focus it? So, helping citizens in their homes, and because that's a place where the relationship is at its most tenuous. So again, it's incremental gains. There's going to be no one trick that is going to solve the whole problem.
I think there was a similar incident with the pigeons in Vancouver as well, where they started giving the pigeons birth control as a way of solving. I don't know much about rat biology, but is it a way that because the pigeons were causing so much problems to the transit systems, and the biggest solution that the city invested so much money in was education, don't feed the pigeons, and two, let's give them birth control.
Yeah.
Do you think, as an expert, can that work in any way? I understand everything else, probably manipulating the environment and all that you've said would work.
Yes.
But if we attack from a biological point of view, I don't know why my brain is trying to
No,
relate
your
to the
brain,
biology of the rats.
your brain is going where everyone's brain is going. I do actually a lot of work with industry. I have collaborated with more industry than I can even imagine on rat control. I've seen every tech that's out there, from the hand flapper that dumps it into an electrocuting solution to the smartphone enabled multi-rat trap that alerts you with a special ping when you've got a rat. I'm actually not kidding you. This is a $1 billion industry in terms of pest control, and it's a $1 billion industry that we've been working on again since medieval times. And yes, people will maybe someday someone will find the magic bullet. I have seen so many solutions come and go that I'm tired of waiting for it. I'm not going to wait for it. And again, it has to do with these animals are so adaptable. They are not like pigeons. Rats are not found. You have to know the system. And the rat system, they are not found in the wild anywhere, pretty much. They're completely adapted to living with people. So they have been evolving as quickly as us and at the same time as us. So interestingly, like, it's really funny, city rats have different behavior than country rats. Just like city people have different behavior than country behavior. City people behave differently than country people. And I just had, there's a fellow who's a National Geographic explorer that's writing a book on animal societies, and he and I have been working with a chapter of rats because he sees so many parallels between the way rats have evolved as a society. So like city rats are actually less neophobic. They're more willing to try new things and be open to possibilities than rats that live in rural areas. Like, I kid you not. So finding, it's just like there's no one thing that's gonna work for all people. So that's part of the problem, is they're incredibly adaptable. They also, pigeons lay 2 children like once a year, right? These guys are having 10 children every 4 weeks. So you're already battling just like reproductively a losing paradigm. And then you've got issues with like, you've trained these animals with all of these rat trapping equipment to be socially scared of intervention. So the best place I can tell you, the Rogers Sugar Factory. I don't think I want anyone that likes sugar in their coffee. Like, beware, because the Rogers Sugar Factory has just an absolutely intractable rat problem. And you go in there, and I would go in there to catch, and they were everywhere. Like, I felt like I could just reach out and grab them. Like, let's just a sack and like this. I could not trap one rat in that whole place. And you go around, and it's because it's relics of the past 100 years of rat control. And they have had social learning where they are intensely neophobic. They have this amazing source of sugar. So they're like, I'm not gonna go for your, peanut butter ball or whatever you're putting there on a strange machine that looks like all the other machines. So it is a lot about understanding the system and being immersed in a lot of this was like just observing how they worked. So if you invent it though, you will seriously, you think Steve Jobs is rich? You'll be rich. This problem around the world. Okay, so let's dive into this for your own projects. So this is going to be our moment of truth, because Mike was had a little bit of trepidation. He's like, I'm not sure all the projects are amenable to systems thinking, but I argue you can at least do some of these components. So that's why I got you to send me all your projects so I could sort of pre-check them. And in everyone's project, I could see some sort of system where there were components, there were relationships between them, and there were different factors affecting decision making or different behaviors. So what I want you to do is I've led you through this activity, and I was going to get people to do it on flip charts. Maybe we'll take a poll of what we think will be the most effective medium for this. Do we think we should do it all on like a PowerPoint slide, and then I should upload it so that people remotely can see it? Or do you guys want to, what would you 3 rather do? Do you rather do it on your computer or on a piece of paper?
I'm gonna do it on the board.
You want to do it on the board?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a good idea.
Okay. Well, we'll have you three here do it on the board, or you can use the flip chart.
Yeah.
And then for people at home, if you want to try this exercise, then maybe do it on a PowerPoint slide and email it to me. I think we're all connected by email, and then I can upload it. So what I want you to do is use this approach to reframe your problem. So I want you to draw and label the components of your system, noting, just like we did here, like, are there elements of each component? Is each component a system in itself? Note the relationships and the kind of characteristics of those relationships, if possible. I have this is a double-stemmed arrow to indicate like values, currencies that you think will be of interest to you. And then I put, if you wanted to do a hashtag for any areas that you could foresee there being like a problem, a potential solution, interesting areas within your system. And then what I want you to do is just define where your problem is within the system, okay? And identify just like even one way in which you could use the system to have some sort of an intervention. Does that make sense to all of you? And then after you've done all this, as you're doing it, maybe, I want you to think about 2 ways in which systems thinking could alter your approach. So you're gonna leave this room, you're gonna go back to your research, and you've got your research plan and you're already on your way. Are there maybe 1 or 2 ways in which using the systems approach could just change the way you think about what you're doing? Okay? So I'm gonna give you, we got on a bit of a tangent with the rats. So let's do like 15 or 20 minutes, okay? And I will erase. Don't show Mike.
Yeah.
He's gonna be like, what was that you
Before
put
you
on
erase
this?
it, I have a question for you. I'm curious, when we're talking about this nexus as a possibility, how successful do you think an intervention here would be when you've got another system out here which will influence, like, so you've got the kind of the Public Health Act that these guys are operating under?
Yes.
And like how do you start thinking about that?
Well, they will not engage on the issue.
Yeah.
Like, they've been invited, and that's fine, I understand. So
Yeah.
since they've not been engaged in the issue, so interestingly enough, rats used to be under public health.
Yeah.
And then it got kicked back and forth over the course of a couple of decades between public health and the city, and it landed back
At the city.
in the city shortly before I started working in public health. It's like,
Right.
we just will not even discuss. So they will literally not engage in this issue, because the moment they say rats pose a health issue, then it has to be their mandate.
Right, but they shut businesses down.
Yeah,
if-
oh, yes.
If there are rodent
This,
issues.
so almost unfortunately, this is gonna start operating as like 2 parallel systems.
Right,
And that's what way it's operating now.
yeah,
Is health takes care of it when it comes to restaurants and inspections.
yeah.
But the city takes care of the problem in all the other spheres of being.
That siloing is nuts.
Yeah, and the city, and these guys regularly, this is how I'm gonna represent this relationship. This is like a very fractious relationship.
Yeah,
And when we started with this program, the city reapproached health and was like, you should be helping to pay for all this. We will not pay for this, we don't even wanna be engaged in it. So then it kind of got kicked back. So,
crazy.
yeah.
Huh. You're giving me an appreciation for rat societies. I was actually at Chapters a week ago buying, there's a woman whose books she writes these amazing essays. And this person who was selling, sort of in line trying to encourage me to join the Indigo program, was like, she started talking about rats for some reason. And telling me about how, oh, I know what it was, because I was talking about the first book this woman, Leslie Jameson, had written called The Empathy Exams. And he just looked at me and he's like, do you know that rats are very empathetic? I'm like, okay, I'm a bit rat phobic, like, I don't know why you're telling me that. He's like, yeah, they demonstrate a really high level of empathy. Interesting, no idea.
Yeah, oh yeah, no, okay. I'm a huge fan of rats.
Yeah.
And that's part of why I love to use also inflammatory language. And I was like doing an interview and saying, you know, are you saying that we should condone an interspecies genocide? Like, which is what,
Yeah.
you know, just killing stuff for no reason.
Yeah.
Without any purpose or example.
Yeah.
And I've made this argument with Parks Canada because I know the vet that runs their rat exploration program in
Right.
parks, and I'm like, he wants to always know about, is this trapping equipment ethical? Because they're totally chased after the next big thing. It's
Right.
like, well, is it really ethical to use any trapping equipment if you don't know
Yeah.
that it's gonna work? So, but I was asked, there's an independent TV production company that makes pitches to the nature of things, and I was just part of a pitch waiting to hear back
Yeah.
about rats. But it does a lot of looks at like the empathy of rats and
Yeah.
the humanization
Yeah.
of rats.
Yeah.
Because they have done interesting experiments where they've shown that, you know, if one rat is in pain, and then they bring another rat in and give it a food treat, it will like give the food treat
Huh?
to the rat that it
Is in pain-
perceives as
is in
being more
pain.
needy than itself.
Huh, interesting.
So,
Hmm. Wow.
yeah.
What, in the city, who, just thinking about Granville Island, because I know that they have a serious problem. Is it the city who would be responsible for dealing with it down there, even though the
Yeah.
island is technically run and managed by the CMHC? Like, there's federal authority down there as well?
That's a great question. They've asked me to do stuff, and they must have some jurisdiction down there.
The
Because
city or the feds?
Yeah, so the city,
Yeah.
because we've talked about Gravel Island.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess
But
we'll get
it
into
is,
that.
yeah,
when we
because
go to
it's
jurisdiction.
actually, everything that is, like, in terms of all of the, like, the retail businesses, all of them are managed by CMHC, so
Mhm.
there is like some federal stuff going on
Mhm.
down there, it's a bit confusing, actually, but I have often, like, and I was thinking about it when you were talking about this, you know, the chaos that's created if you go in and just annihilate them, it's like, oh crap, like, what if they do that at Granville Island?
And I think
what
the
it-
city must be involved, because
Yeah.
they provide garbage services and stuff to Gravel Island, don't they? Or is it?
It's a good
Like
question,
water?
I don't know,
That's interesting. I'll have to ask
yeah.
our streets guys. They don't get this there's definitely different also like neighborhood tolerances
Yeah,
of the issue, and they seem to be actually like relatively well tolerated. They're almost
Well,
like part
living
of
next to Gravel Island.
yeah, they're like part
Yeah,
of the
yeah.
landscape.
Yeah, because, I mean, not only do we have rats, but we also have otters and
yeah.
skunks.
Yeah, but, you know, I think, I mean, one of the things that was struck me when you were talking about like what are the relationships between, you know, the local government and the people, I mean, the big part of it is the optics of it, right? Like, the optics are that they're filthy, like that if we've got the city that's overrun with rats, you know, that do visitors wanna come? And so, like, the optics of having Granville Island, which everyone thinks of as the public market, which is food, that there are rats there, that would, I mean, there's over 10 million visitors to Granville Island a year. Like,
But they also have lots of places that they can hide.
oh, yeah.
Right? So if they're not necessarily visible.
No, that's
as you
true.
would think they would be.
Yeah, no, that is true. It's not like they're,
And we've got coyotes.
not like,
So we've got,
sugar.
we've got the natural
Yeah.
I know.
coyotes.
Yes, that's
if
true.
only they ate enough.
Yeah.
You'd have to get some really, some places they find like sniffer dogs,
Yeah.
cats, but then they do studies and they just don't even scratch the surface. The only thing that scratches the surface is like the environmental carrying, like the carrying capacity of the environment.
Yeah.
But I was listening to the Under the Influence on my way here, and there was a marketing exec saying, I'm convinced that half my budget on marketing is wasted, I just don't know which half.
Yeah.
And that was about like the unpredictability, and that's definitely been a huge, emergent behavior has been a huge part for working with the city about places you'd think there would be a problem, where there's not a problem, and other places where you wouldn't think there is a problem where there is, and I'm still like piecing that part together.
Yeah.
So trying to figure out why rats upset people, but it's funny you say it is. So when I was asked to like do something, I said, what is what is your metric of success? What would success look like for the city? And they say, the number one metric, so at first we were talking about rat numbers, and like we're gonna have rat censuses, and we're gonna show like an objective decrease. And I said, okay, if you could have one thing, what would you got? Decrease calls on the 311 line. The number one metric of success for them.
Yeah.
And so that's what got us into this, because I'm like, well, if you want to decrease calls, you need to deal with this, which is the relationship, not with the rats themselves. You need to understand why people are calling
Yeah.
and what they want the city to do about it.
Yeah.
And that's how, and then you could have no calls, still have the same number of rats, but you're like, objective achieved, and you go to city council and
Right.
nobody like
Yeah, yeah.
When I moved to Canada from the UK, one of the first things I was told when I moved to Edmonton was they don't have any rats. Alberta has no.
Yeah, that's true, that is I'm not saying that it is true, but that is something that they take pride in, that they
Yes.
think that they have no rats.
Is-
Right, is that true?
possible?
Well, Alberta it's so funny. I have one of my graduate students is now working in Alberta, and she is like a student in the history of Alberta's tail tax on rats. Where I do believe it, but it was an amazing nexus of circumstances. Like, just, they did it before the city was a metropolis. It didn't have a lot of traffic in and out. It was relatively small, so I don't think they had like a very significant rat population, and they really got the citizens engaged because they paid them every time you did a tail, a tail. But then, so they tried to use that tail tax. I have a colleague in Australia that works on rat plagues, they call them in Southeast Asia when the rice crops bloom. And they have these like amazing plagues like across the landscape of rats. And they said, okay, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do tail tax. You'll get people engaged in the problem, it's like super grassroots. And so then they got all these tails. Oh yeah, it was really awesome. And then the plague died down and they got all these tails and then there were no rats. So I'm like, where's the tail coming? People were there was a cottage industry, people were breeding rats to kill them, cut off their tails, and sell them.
Yikes.
Because they were making money off it in that context. So it was a great, that was a great solution for the Alberta system, but it just like failed miserably in the like Southeast Asia system.
That's funny.
So I'm just gonna get myself a drink of water and I'll come back and check in.
When I wrote stamps, I was on Hawaii. One of my friends was showing me pictures from, maybe at a Facebook page actually, because they had done a rat cull on Hawaii. Yeah, and my friend was like, somebody was like, hey Chris, isn't that your garden? And there's a guy standing there holding like the king rat. I'm like, it's the size of a small dog. Yikes. So I haven't heard from George if he has slides to show. He may be emailing them after, because I know Chelsea said she was going to introduce the coronavirus piece of things, and then, okay.
Yeah.
So I think what I'm gonna get you to do is start, I see you've already got lots of stuff. So come migrate up here and we'll start just doing your rough version. You don't have to put in all the details because you can explain it, but the rough version on the board.
But it just gone to the washroom. It's okay.
It's like, whoa, Twilight Zone. And they're gone.
That would definitely be a fail from my perspective.
Oh, yeah. So the students
Students
actually
all
like
left the room.
actively flee,
Yes.
like rats, out of the classroom at the first adverse.
So they're not canceling evening classes.
Oh, really?
No, they're going, which is good, because I am on transit, so like
That
if
means
they
the
had
transit's
canceled,
better,
if
yeah.
they had canceled the evening classes, that would have probably meant transit would have been
Good point.
crazy.
Good point.
Hugh, been meaning to tell you guys, it's on the second round of revisions on that American Journal paper. The occupational disease paper, yeah. I didn't actually bug you guys when I went through the first round of revision, because the revisions came back and they were like, this reads more like a policy paper. I feel like you need, so I was like, basically wrote it the way I had originally written it, and then various people, not you guys, had said, we feel like this is too detailed, so I was like, oh, screw it. And so I just put in all the detail, and the reviewers actually really liked it, so, yeah, so there's some minor changes. I wanted me to talk more about the methodology as a limitation, like the scoping review methodology as a limitation. Paul's having a quick look at it, and then it'll go in. So, yeah, they seem to, it's funny, because I've been so close to that project for so long that I'm like, why would anyone be interested? And people are like, this is really, we think this is gonna actually be of value. Yay. After all those years,
You're lucky
yay.
about that paper,
Yeah.
2 years of work.
Yes.
Oh, this could have some value.
Yeah,
Well, that's a
yay.
plus.
Yeah.
I don't know if this, I'm gonna talk to the cameras if there are students on the other side.
They're
So-
supposed to be.
Yeah.
They were earlier.
The only problem with the hitch in our giddy up is that you can't explain your systems to us because we can't hear you. So I think what we will do is we will talk about the 3 systems on the board, and for those of you who sent me the systems by email, if you're interested, we can have a phone conversation about it, about the system you've proposed. Okay. And I'm sorry, it's very awkward talking to the camera person. I do a lot of on-camera media interviews, so you think I would be used to it, but I still feel awkward. Okay, so I'll give you guys about 4 more minutes.
Full disclosure, I've actually had pet rats several times in my life. It's when the movie Ratatouille came out. It became my favorite movie. Showing it to everyone. It's so cute.
If my kids were, my daughter's lobbying me for a hamster, and I was like, if you want a pet, I'll get you a rat.
Yeah.
Give you a hamster. Rats are kinder,
Oh, they're
easier to
smart.
train.
They're really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And actually, one of the funny things, there's a lot of people who have pet rats in the downtown east side. And we caught a lot of rats that were like interesting calico colored rats
Oh, yeah.
and like hybrids of,
Yeah.
so we had sort of like a wall of fame of the fanciest rats caught, so.
I confess that I saw Ratatouille, actually it was Zoe, the one who's now at UVic, when she was a little kid. And I had just completed, I actually at one point left this field and went to culinary school, so I'm a trained chef as well. And I remember sitting in that movie and I'm like, there's part of me that's loving this and a part of me is horrified at the idea of a rat in the kitchen. I was like, ah. And then I actually made my niece sit through the credits because I'm like, I want to know what chef it was that advised them because of the beautiful ratatouille they made. And she was just like, but I can't read. Yeah, it was just like this part of me that's like, I love this, but I'm hating
Yes,
this.
there's like there's a cognitive dissonance for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. The one time, ironically enough, that I do get engaged by Coastal Health, a different group of people, is there's not uncommonly outbreaks of rat bite fever in reptile breeders because they feed rats to their reptiles, and then they grow their own rodent colonies. It's the cheapest thing, and they get this, and then they're not like pet rats, so they're not acclimatized, so they bite a lot, and then people will get sick, and so I've had it on. Been involved in like a couple outbreaks of that and a couple of outbreaks with like pet stores.
Yeah.
People getting bitten in pet stores.
Huh.
But the reptile one is like the number one biggest one.
Yeah. Interesting.
They get so many.
There's part of me that's actually, it was like 6 months ago, I thought, because I'll walk down the street or walk down my.
Okay, you got one more minute. It doesn't have to be perfect. Is it?
Or if you just give me, and I'm seeing rats, and I just like, I get paralyzed, and I'm like, I need to figure out, I feel like I need to go to therapy to figure out why I'm so phobic. Because I'm just like, yes,
A little animal.
breeze. I know,
Okay,
I'm the
you're
same
gonna
with
be our
mice,
first up.
mice and rat, yeah, but
Because
particularly,
squirrels don't, right?
I hate squirrels.
Okay.
Somebody actually made a comment.
Why don't we reconvene over here at Asan's model? And I don't know if we can like rotate the camera over this way, Karen, or?
Basically squirrels are rats.
Okay, so this is like,
Better
this is the
fashion
group
designer.
think portion. Okay, so if you have comments on places that maybe you see connections or you might see some dynamic behavior, then speak out. But why don't you explain to us, maybe tell us the scenario, like the issue, and then the system.
The issue is that we have chemicals that workers get in contact with, which are called toxic chemicals. And these are known to cause hearing loss without noise exposure. So my project is to investigate whether a dose-response relationship can be established between exposure to certain chemicals, which are lead, styrene, toluene, and mercury, and hearing loss.
Okay,
So hearing loss is the health outcome, and the exposure is exposure to these chemicals, which are called phototoxic chemicals.
got it.
On one hand, we have the employers, which are one of the components of the system. They have production goals, and they have health and safety issues which they have to balance together.
Mm-hmm.
So they do not sacrifice one in favor of other in terms of spending too much.
Keep talking.
So another issue is that the employer should be aware of the problem that exposure to these chemicals causes problems.
Okay.
Yep. And the employer provides resources which will be connected to the next issue that I will talk about, these controls. So in the workplace, workers are going to use different work methods based on the layout of the workplace and how the chemicals are going to be used. There are going to be controls in the place to prevent exposure of the workers to these chemicals. One more thing is that if there is a problem with noise exposure, it might exacerbate hearing loss from exposure to these chemicals.
Oh,
So
that's
all these
interesting.
issues should be taken into consideration for the workplace as well.
But that is a different,
Yes.
okay?
On this side, we have workers who, again, depending on their training and education that they have received, might be effectively using the controls that they are given to. And there will be also additional behavioral factors which will contribute to their use of controls as well. And lastly, we have those chemicals that I was talking about. But then again, the dose is very important, and the form that is being used in the workplace, it might be in the form of a dust, or it could be vapor, which the workers come in contact with. So among all these, I think one important thing is that what kind of, the level of resources that the employer has provided for implementation and provision of controls, the level of noise, and the dose. All of these will indicate, depending on the dose, what kind of controls you would need. So it has to be effective enough to reduce the dose below a certain level, which will ensure that your workers are safe. The training and education and behavioral factors, as I said, also influence the controls, because workers might be given, for example, personal protective equipment, but may end up not using it.
Okay.
But for my project, this is the important part, because I just want to find out whether there is a certain dose of those chemicals below which hearing loss does not occur.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one important part where I'm going to conducting the literature review to see if, based on the research that has been conducted until now, we can establish a dose which, for example, for lead, we could say the blood lead level below, for example, 2 microgram per deciliter would mean that the person is not at risk of hearing loss. Anything above that would cause a hearing loss problem.
Mm-hmm. This is awesome. This is a very exciting system. I have some questions. Does anyone else want me to comment? Comment about? So does I want to like draw some connections, because I know I can tell this is where you're working, because there's a lot of thoughts happening here, right? But like employer, this is the big connection, right? The workers have to want to work and not sue people, and the employers need the workers to work so they can get their currency, right? And then this is also the connection, right? It's really like,
Yes.
and this sort of modifies
Yep.
that. Are there any?
Probably I could take workplace to here between workers and chemicals, because that's how they are exposed. So
Well, yeah, I wouldn't. Part of it is separating it out, because there's different points for intervention. I have a question of who regulates this system. So if you found there was a health, is this going to be like workplace safety? Is there any like governing
that's
bodies?
a very good question. We do not currently have regulations on exposure to ototoxic chemicals.
Okay.
So that's one of the reasons why I chose to study this for my project.
Is this work safety? Is that the correct acronym?
Yeah.
Work
Or
safety.
USBC, yeah.
Okay. Well, let's bring them in here, because they are involved in this system, right?
Yes.
Where they protect the workers and they regulate the employers, and they presumably like have regulations about the workplace, and then maybe they should be be informed
Yeah,
about
that's-
this? Yeah,
The final goal.
yeah,
So to inform the regulator about a problem which is not currently addressed in the regulation directly.
okay. That's, so, because this is neat, one of the things that that first paper said, that the most beautiful pearl, but super hidden in that really complicated language, is the idea of like leverage points, of identifying the best points. And they made the case that without systems thinking, interventions were often made at points where they didn't have maximum effect. But you could use this to identify the potential points. So that's why I started making stars, right? Like, could you inform WorkSafe BC so that then they have a standard? And then, so this is why I also like this, about, I put the currency here, like, do you have, what sort of protections could workers use themselves?
It could be down to, we call it engineering controls, which is ventilation system, but those that relate directly to the worker could be also personal protective equipment.
Okay,
Or even in case the workers are exposed to noise, they might also have to wear earmuffs so that their problem is not aggravated.
okay. So there is potential to have personal protective equipment.
There is, yes.
Okay, because that's gonna be interesting then to like think about the currency of what would make people use that and not use that. And then of course, like employers play a big role in this culture, right? Of what's doing that, so that's like a potential point. And then of course the employers, but I like your idea, so they're after the bottom line, you'd like to have, I'm convinced that Disneyland has more altruistic motives, but that's the only company that I trust, is Disneyland. So is there anything that would motivate the employer to protect their workers?
Well, one motivator could be the regulator. I mean, it's
Without
not
the
exactly
regulator,
how-
just on this axis?
Probably prevention of claims maybe 20, 30 years down the road.
Okay,
When the worker loses their degree.
yeah,
That's
And if any safety incident happens, then the employer will lost a lot of money, including the workers' time. They need to hire new workers, they need to train new workers, and something like that.
okay, that's helpful, because then you're seeing like what are gonna be motivators to, because you can use the stick. It's probably like also good to use the carrot and maybe give people control over their own. Okay, we have to move on, but anything else, any connection that you see?
Yeah, the last question was what I was also thinking about too, the connection between the employer and the worker, and what is actually beneficial in terms of either losing or gaining money as well, because once claims go down, employer benefits and workers also benefit, so that's an important relationship.
Okay. Yeah, actually you bring up a good one, if you've got a group health benefits
Yeah.
and they're paying for those, right? But you brought up one entry that is a total, I think I put hashtag for like dynamic behaviors. That is like a total emergent behavior, right? Like they say you can't create, you can't like force culture. It's something that emerges based on like the parts in the relationships. So like how, and that it might be a tricky one because that might make an intervention work in one setting but not another setting, right? So that's something to think about if you were suggesting an intervention. Okay, let's move down to the next one.
So my topic is about climate change and extreme temperatures and how workers, actually outdoor workers, are impacted by it. And I intend using scenarios to actually think through climate change and what might happen during climate change and how it would impact workers with a solution that we can come up with setting controls to actually help protect workers better. So here I have the regulator, which is WorkSafe BC in this case.
Chelsea,
Um,
just, okay, thanks, perfect.
The regulator is WorkSafe BC. Then I have the worker, the employer, the environment, which actually would influence climate change, so they build a natural environment. So in terms of relationship, I do see a relationship between the regulator and the worker, because the worker is at the center of discussion and also of betterment. So the regulator want to make sure that workers are healthy and safe. And so there's that relationship in between them. And also, if workers are not safe, they would go back to the regulators to take money, insurance claims, and all that. So regulator want to make sure workers are good. And so is the employer. So there's also a relationship between the employer and the worker. And also establish a relationship between the employer and the environment, because most companies, if they're having a lot of effluent, it goes into the environment that enhances climate change. So there's that, again, impact between relationship between climate change and environment. I also see relationship between the regulator in this case and also the employer, because in VC, employers do pay premiums to the regulator to ensure that there's enough money in the system, and so when a worker becomes sick, that could take care of the worker. And because I'm looking at outdoor worker, whatever happens in terms of the climate moving forward in future will affect the employer and his business.
So I
if
think
your
Barney
workers are
is
sick,
figuring out whether George has
then
slides
employers
to
will
send
lose
us.
money. The climate change will also influence workers directly, because as they move through the environment with the sun, with pollution, climate change will actually reduce UV, and so workers can have a host of other diseases like cancer, for example, the ozone, which will increase UV. So that's also a problem. So there's that interaction here. I also see, I think the regulator will have an interest on the environment as well. And so in terms of money, I see dollar signs here. Resources will either go down or increase between the regulator and the employer. I also see relationship for money value also here too, between the employer and the worker. And also between the regulator and the worker as well. I don't know if I'm missing anything.
No, that was very well thought out comments from this before. Our time is ticking away a little bit. Your project, I think, is particularly interesting because to me it shows what are the barriers to systems thinking, and I'm going to translate the last part of our class to an online conversation between the four of us about like what do we perceive as barriers and opportunities. So we'll put that to the end. But when I was reading yours and thinking about the system, to me a barrier is scalability. I think you've really captured all the interconnections, but I have a hard time commenting because I have a hard time conceptualizing like specifics within the scenario, right? Whereas Ihan's was very specific, right? So it was sort of like, well, put on masks and do this. Yours is scaled at like a much greater ratio, but it's sort of the details and the intervention points are sort of less obvious. Do you foresee there is a whale a whale is also large, difficult to handle, that you could scale it down to, like, do you think there is a solution that could be implemented on this scale?
So there wouldn't be,
Other than stopping this.
yeah, so my focus is not about, let's say, stopping climate change, but adaptation to climate change. So what I intend doing is looking at different climate scenarios.
Okay.
And in each scenario, what we can anticipate happening and how the worker here can be protected.
Yeah.
So what controls could be there if it's too hot, especially with outdoor workers, for example, farmers, for instance, what should they do?
Okay.
What controls, what PPEs can they wear? What could be some engineering controls to actually help them do their job? So that will be embedded in the scenario setting.
I love this because you could almost see, I can see your peer-reviewed systems-based paper now. Because it's like this is your base model, and now you're going to take it out to like specific scenarios where you can So that's helpful. That's helpful to know. And climate change suffers from this problem. With the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, we're trying to do resiliency work, but we think about it on this scale, and it's really hard to think of interventions on this scale. So, so I'll be interested to see if you can translate this type of thinking to your specific scenarios.
Yeah, it's exactly what I intended. Yeah, it will be much more embedded in the scenarios if you change the focus and the way the interactions will be. So the interactions will vary from one scenario to the other.
Okay, well, this is your assignment, is to come back after your degree and report back on whether, and also the degree to which this model held, like, to what principles held true among scenarios, and what were like completely system specific. And also if it's possible to map a global system. I've changed this capstone project. That's the goal. Okay, really quickly, I'm sorry you got left in.
Okay, sure. Well, my capstone project is to focus on the difference between, say, Canada's, United States, and China's OEH systems. Of course, this capstone project is a little bit ambitious, so I'm going to focus on specific topics such as asbestos use, noise, confined space, ventilation system, those kind of stuff. But here in this system thinking chart, I would like to put it as a whole part, as an OEH system here. And other core elements is the government, the citizens, and some background. The government consists the central government, local government, and also the public health professionals. And the citizens consist, I used employers and workers as a group, and the non-workers, such as the students, the older generations, the babies, as another group, because we are concerning not only occupational regulation laws, but also environmental health regulation laws. And also,
We'll call them as people. I want to know where the people, I'm putting the people here in your system.
okay.
For now. Okay, keep going.
Okay, well, and also I used the background. I divided the background into the technologies.
Okay. Is this setting? Is this place? Like what is background?
It's something like related to the country's whole system.
Okay,
The
okay.
economic of the country, the
Okay.
technology of the country, the educational levels of the country. It's something like that.
Okay. So it's something to do with, let's just call it, but you're doing one for Canada, right?
Yeah.
And China, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful.
So for the relationship between them, let's say that first, the employer and workers group, they influence occupational health regulations and law in nature. And also, for the non-workers, the environmental related laws, they influence each others. And the central governments influence the local governments and also influence public health professionals. However, when I try to find some connections between those elements, I found there's only the economic related to the central government quite tightly. Say, the economics influence the central government's choice and their decisions, and the economics decide how the technology would be, decide how the people's education level would be. And people's education levels will influence the non-workers and the workers, their daily lives, how they treat their risk, how they treat their safety regulations, how they treat their environment emission regulations, something like that. And also, people affect local governments more than they affect central government. And after the local government receives those response from the citizens, they then give advice to central government, and central governments do the adjustment to the occupational and environmental regulation law. And for each local government, they make their modification themselves for those laws.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the relationship is like that. And for Actually, economic here is something like money.
Mhm.
The money influences everything. Money influences the central government choice. Say, although the asbestos is fully banned in Canada, but it is not banned in China, also not banned in United States, Brazil, and the Russian, because they do have some relationship between the economic. The government need to make choice between the money and the public health. And also, the money influence the technology. The technology influence the employer's choice when they implement something, say, more environment friendly, more safe, something emits less pollutions to their workers. Yeah, something like that. The money influences technology, and the money influences education levels. If the people have more money, they have more family incomes, then they can get to a better school, better high school, get higher education level, and then the education level will influence their thoughts towards to those regulations. Is these regulations or law too soft or too tight for us? And then they influence the central government.
This is, okay. I know we're, any comments?
I think politics also can be added.
And
Politics.
Yeah, I think I get where you're, do you have any comments?
I was just looking at the relation between the government and the citizens, but I think you've established that. Right. Between the,
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
citizens influence local governments
Okay.
directly, and then the local governments influence the central governments.
So wait, so were you, so when I saw you started to fill this out, I'm like, this, it seems like you want to compare two systems completely,
Yeah.
right? Which is like,
not completely.
okay.
Actually, I was want to just focus on specific.
Okay.
Specific, yeah, and
No, that's fine. No, I think this was really, like, I was going with you on this journey. I was educated, because I felt, were you describing China more than?
yeah,
more
I'm
than
describing
anything
my
else?
country a lot.
Okay, because it would be so interesting to do like a parallel system of China versus Canada, because that's when you get into, that's why I put this, is why this system is so fascinating to me in terms of currencies, right? Because in the comparison, what you were describing is like, this is the main currency, and maybe the citizens don't have a lot of impact on the central government. Whereas at the federal level, like the votes are the currency, and they will spend money like crazy to get votes on,
Exactly.
you know,
Yeah.
intangibles. So it's funny because we talked a lot about money, but I guess one of the things, closing things I want to leave you off with is currency can be much more insidious than that and not readily transparent. So think about like different forms of currency that they trade in, like social capital, political capital. That's a huge one when I worked, for example, with the city of Vancouver about, you know, Vancouver wants to be the greenest city, so we don't want to do poison because that's not good social capital or social license to do that. And the other thing we got on is to sell this idea of, for example, like a wildlife health veterinarian, because that's, we're gonna bring a veterinarian, they're so cuddly and cute, and that's gonna be great social capital, buy us this currency. So that's just, like, it may seem that this is the only currency, but I would challenge you to see that there's other currencies maybe going back and forth.
Yeah, and that is the
Within here,
difference
yeah.
between these countries.
Yeah, so interesting, but I think you should do a map of Canada versus China and how the two systems differ, because that would be really fascinating. Okay, so we have to wrap it up there, but, so the homework is, for the last part, is to just go home, marinate on the experience. I hope we didn't leave you in the abyss of the hero's journey, but